So 1960s में दादा, now I want to read the tweet that you had co-tweeted me. This led to this podcast. So आपने specifically उसमें एक कुछ लिखा था कि murderous political violence was always there. It got mainstreamed in 1960s with the advent of the United Front governments. Since then, violence as politics has been the norm. Class struggle of yesterday is khela hobe of today. Now let's get into the 1960s, Dada. So, what exactly did the United Front governments do?
No, so West Bengal was, I think, the first state where the Congress collapsed, and
Hmm.
rightly so. Uh, Kushal, I often make this point, and I just want to go back, slide back a bit, and just reiterate this point.
Please.
My father, my parents, my people, they were put into camps which were labeled permanent liability camps. So we were supposed to be permanent liabilities of the government of India, of this country. Now, if you look at it this way, between my father, my brother, myself, my uncles, uh, my larger family, we would have paid way more taxes to the government of India, and we are happy. We paid those taxes happily. We contributed happily because this was our country. This was the only country we had. So whatever we could do, we did for this country because this country had given us a place when we had nowhere to go. But if I were to tabulate and just calculate, forget my father, even if I were to tabulate the taxes which I have paid in my life, that would be way more the taxes which Nehru's Khandan has paid in their entire lifetime. I can take a bet on that, and I will be happy to lose that bet, but I can take a bet on that. So, what permanent liability? What liability? If there is any permanent liability that Nehru has left behind, it is his Khandan. But moving on. Now, coming back to the 1960s. Now, why is it important that we look at 1960s in Bengal very closely? The Congress collapses. The Congress sort of dissipates, crumbles, and there is a faction of the Congress and several other parties which come together and form what is called the United Front government. And uh, at in the sort of the split in the Communist Party had happened in 1964. So you had the CPIM and the CPI, and Jyoti Basu, who was in the CPIM, he convinces the CPIM that we should join the government. This is our moment in the sun, and this is the launch pad that we have been looking for. And in the late 1960s, 1966, 67, the United Front government comes to power, and Jyoti Basu is the deputy chief minister and the home minister. And that is where the political legitimization of violence begins. So it happens on three fronts. There was this famous historic brigade ground rally where Jyoti Basu read out the the principles of governance, or the principles of governance as perceived and conceived by the CPIM, the Marxists, uh, and one of them was that labor shall have the right to protest in any manner it wishes to, and that takes shape and form by way of what came to be known as Gherao. Now, Gherao was not a very it never existed, or even if it existed, it was never a very prominent method of protest. But in Bengal, what happens is that Gherao becomes a very violent method of protest. Managers were gheraued, owners were gheraued. Uh, in fact, there were instances where people died. I mean, people who were gheraued, they died, or some. There was one instance where the manager of a company, it was a British company, British owned company, and I will not take names because his descendant may not like his name being taken. But this family, the British owners had to arrange for the manager and his family to be flown out of Calcutta to London. So their lives were at threat. Their lives were endangered even after the Gherav was over. And this was the scale of political or the protests that were happening. This was one part of it. So you see that the ruling party, or one of the ruling parties in the ruling coalition, sanctifies political violence by way of labor violence. That is one part. The second part is, after the split in the Communist Party, you had the Marxists and you had the CPI, and then a third faction emerges, that is the far left. So over 68, 69, the third group emerges, and that is the Communist Party of India, Marxist Leninist, popularly known as the Naxalites. And they bring in, uh, so if the Marxists were sanctifying working class violence, the far left or the Naxals bring in class as class war as justification for violence. And the scope of the Naxal violence was much wider than that of the Marxist sponsored violence, because they were targeting representatives of the state. Uh, the policemen were attacked and killed. The politicians and political workers were attacked. The vice chancellor of Jadavpur University was killed, and in a very macabre manner, in a macabre display of political violence, the statue of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was decapitated. So, and it was symbolic, but it nonetheless represented the nature of the violence. And the third part of it was the counter violence that happens. So you had the Marxist violence, you had the Marxist Leninist violence, and you had the counter violence of the state. So there are two successive United Front governments, UF1, UF2. uh, the governments fail, the governments get dismissed, governor takes over, president's rule is imposed. And between the fall of the second United Front government and the imposition of president's rule and the next election, which is held, the entire state is under president's rule, and there is huge repression that happens. So anybody who is considered to be opposed to the state or opposed to the Congress is sort of neutralized. And for those who are listening to this podcast, uh, uh, the Jhumpa Lahiri's book, it is called, the name now escapes my mind. So you should read that book, because that, although it's fictional, but it's fiction, but it sort of uh, gives a very vivid picture of the times. And this interregnum is used to crush all left opposition. The brutalities are manifold. The army is called in, and the and Siddhartha Shankar Ray, who was the rising star of the Congress, he plays a leading role. In one particular incident, leftists were picked up, young boys and girls were picked up, they were killed, and then their bodies were dipped into, those big machines in which you melt tar to lay roads. So their bodies were dipped into the molten tar and then dumped, so that they would never be people would never figure out whose body it was. So that was the kind of counter violence happening, and the other side was no less brutal. So this is the backdrop of the transition from romanticization of violence to political violence. And later, when Siddharth Shankar Ray becomes the chief minister and the Congress is in power through the emergency, uh, the counter brutality happens.